So let's talk about the Avenging Son himself. How does Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, hold up in Codex Space Marines? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd take a focused look at the datasheet of none other than the Primarch himself. How well does Guilliman hold up in game? We'll talk briefly about his model, go over his datasheet, and a few thoughts for options to play him in game, and his overall strength. Roboute Guilliman definitely made a splash when he returned to Warhammer 40k. His model release was really quite a big deal at the time, the first of the Loyalist Primarchs to return to the current setting, now joined by Lionel Johnson as well of course, and I wouldn't be too surprised if we get more to come from Games Workshop over the next few years. Guilliman certainly doesn't need too much introduction, one of the most famous 40k characters out there. Famed strategist and Primarch of the Ultramarines, it was he who wrote the Codex Astartes that dictates how Space Marine chapters have their fighting doctrines these days. As Lord Commander of the Imperium, he's taken up the Emperor's sword to defend humanity in his father's name, first in the Indomitus Crusades and now more lately against High Fleet Leviathan. I think his miniature's nice enough to represent him, really. It's got the option of a helmeted and unhelmeted head. Maybe didn't go down to quite as much instant love as Lionel Johnson did when he came out, but still remains definitely quite a fun and popular model, as with quite a few of the other Primarchs. His price from GW is £42.50, $70 or €55, and weirdly enough, if you're trying to get points of a Space Marine army together, he's actually one of the best buys for Space Marines, up there along with combat patrols and starter kits if you just want to get points on the table for the amount of money spent. 5.1 points per dollar is about as good as 40k usually gets. As ever, if you're looking to pick up the Primarch of the Ultramarines, he'll be significantly cheaper through third-party discount retailers, things like Element Games in the UK or Gap Games in Australia, linked down in the video description, and those links do help support Auspex Tactics and these videos. Getting onto his rules in game though, and Roboute Guilliman is 360 points. That's now his third points value in 10th edition. Previously he was a little bit cheaper than that, and then got a bit more expensive in the first balance update. He likely went down in points due to having both of his Master of Battle and Supreme Strategist abilities nerfed slightly, but we'll get onto that in a second. As an Ultramarine keyword character, he can only be fielded by the Ultramarines at the moment, means that you can't have him alongside other Space Marine characters or his brother Lionel Johnson. In days past you could field him in just about any Imperial army in a Supreme Command detachment, but that's no longer the case outside of casual games and house ruling. For how his miniature works on the tabletop, he moves 8 inches, so relatively fast, and he has the monster keyword, interestingly enough. I guess he is enormous compared with just about any other Space Marine out there. It does mean that he can't fit in transports and has to move around things like ruined walls, as opposed to going through doors or windows like Space Marines might. For protecting him on the board, he has a rule called Ultramarines Bodyguard. It means that he gains the lone operative ability, so he can't be shot outside of 12 inches, provided he's at least within 3 inches of at least one Adeptus Astartes infantry unit. That means that usually he's not going to be able to be shot at long range, and your opponent is actually going to have to get up fairly close and personal with him. Maybe not the best for them given his melee stat line. I think the general idea will be to have something durable advance up the board alongside him, but in general perhaps even more powerfully is if he were just standing within 3 inches of a Ultramarines unit that was completely out of line of sight, maybe some intercessors holding a backfield objective behind a ruin perhaps, or even if he was in 3 inches of another lone operative model, which there are some of. He could be next to the combi weapon lieutenant, or next to a tech marine that's next to a vehicle, and weirdly enough they do satisfy the criteria that they're Adeptus Astartes infantry. It means that he's basically got quite a lot of options where you're just not really going to be able to target him directly, and that is pretty powerful for having him survive into the late game and get that melee stat line to good use. For his defensive profile, he is quite tanky even if he can catch up with him. Toughness 9, a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable and 10 wounds. Small arms aren't really going to be any threat to him whatsoever, but more mid-strength things like auto cannons or missile launchers and certainly las cannons will take him down at least reasonably quickly. He averages taking around about 7 las cannon hits before he is destroyed, or around about 30 overcharged plasma or 24 auto cannons. As ever, and like with 9th edition, it might not be the end of it though. When he dies for the first time, he gets back up on a 3+ with 6 wounds remaining. Hugely intimidating for the opponent, and perhaps particularly so because it happens at the end of the phase. Means that if he was completely isolated to enemy shooting, they might well shoot him dead with all their weapons, then he just gets up at the end of the phase anyway and still survives the turn. Ideally does mean though that you don't really want him to be in a position where he can take a massive amount of shooting, and then the opponent can also go on to charge him with something scary enough to kill him outright. But plenty of armies that only really deal damage in one big phase or another just might not be able to do that. I'd say the 3 plus Resurrect is definitely very nice. It's really not reliable though, and you can't command point reroll it. It's probably not the best idea to try and test that if you don't have to. Maybe playing at least a little bit cagey and not just throwing him headlong into the enemy and hope he gets back up. For his damage, he gets a little bit of shooting with the Hand of Dominion, 2 attacks to 30 inches with Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2, going to 4 attacks to 15 with Rapid Fire. Not the most exciting damage output in the world, but certainly worth it for killing a couple of Space Marines perhaps. Definitely feels like an extra nice to have though, and you'd have to weigh up between that and advancing to get better positioning, at least if he wasn't charging this turn. Of course, it's far more standout in combat as well, having either the Emperor's Sword or the Hand of Dominion to strike with, essentially a sweep and strike mode pretty much. The Emperor's Sword is 14 attacks at Strength 8, AP -3 and Damage 2 with devastating wounds, whereas the Hand of Dominion is more kind of an anti-tank weapon. 7 attacks at Strength 14, AP 4 and Damage 4, and also lethal hits as well, which doesn't hurt, though most of the time you'd be wounding on a 3+ anyway. For his damage output, he'll average around about 10 slain Horde models, say like Termagants or Imperial Guard. Not too far behind that with Space Marines, around about 8 or 9 of them slain. The Emperor's Sword certainly goes through them pretty quickly. He perhaps might struggle most with things like Terminators with high and vulnerable saves. He averages around about 3 of them dead, and is better off using the Emperor's Sword for the most part due to the devastating wounds. Otherwise, he perhaps really shines against hard targets, particularly ones without invulnerable saves, the Hand of Dominion doing around about 18 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle, going down to 12 on average with a vehicle with a 5+ invulnerable. Overall, between all that, he really is very general purpose, perhaps particularly nice at killing standard Space Marines and single heavy targets. There's a good chance that he'll kill most normal sized units in the 40k game in a single round of combat. Then, while his melee might is pretty legendary, it's really his strategy and command that Guilliman is really known for, and his author of the Codex special rule allows you to pick one of 3 rules at the start of the command phase to help out his brother Space Marines in battle. The first one I'd say is by far the most niche, an aura of 6 inches of +1 objective control and re-rolling battle shock tests. For the most part, I'd say that's pretty low value, though occasionally, if literally that objective control aura is the thing that flips objectives into your control and gets you straight victory points, then it's probably going to be the one to go for, even if you lose some damage dealing. I think in reality that's rarely going to be the case though. For the second option, he gets Oath of Moment on a second target. If you manage to destroy your first Oath of Moment target, then the Master of Battle ability allows you to declare a new one after that. So basically you're gambling that you'll be able to destroy the first Oath of Moment one and still have enough useful stuff in your army to get 4 hit rerolls against the next one, which to be fair is really quite a good damage boost. It's definitely less good than it used to be. When it was 4 hit rerolls and 4 wound rerolls, it was pretty standout amazing. Now it's just hit rerolls, I'd say it's kind of fine. A very nice thing to have in the army, but maybe not quite as exciting given that you have to pay for a 360 point model to get it. Otherwise, his third ability is Supreme Strategist, and this one now allows you to use 1 free battle tactic stratagem per turn on a unit within 12 inches, and he pays 0 CP for it. It's basically a drastically upgraded version of the Captain special rule, particularly nice as you can use it on any unit within 12 inches, so it could allow you to use the battle tactics on some unusual targets, maybe things like free armor of contempt for dreadnoughts for example, or even squads that captains can't join, things like Centurions perhaps. This one I would say is a bit detachment specific really. Depends on whether or not you've got battle tactics that are reliable enough just to use turn in, turn out. Armor of Contempt's really quite a good one for the enemy turn, you just need one of the ones to be usable in yours. Overall, each turn I'd probably weigh up mainly between the Oath of Moment one or the battle tactic, unless the first one is literally going to score you straight victory points. Overall, putting that all together, Guilliman is basically a big fighty and dangerous centrepiece to a Space Marine army. Really quite a big investment at 360 points. At a 2000 point army, that's over a sixth of your forces. Some powerful army boosts that you really want to keep alive if you can, paired with some very dangerous melee. But I'd say even with the disruptive armour of Fates, he's maybe not the most tough point for point. Anything with high strength, AP and damage does tend to kill him at least fairly quickly if he's exposed. For that reason, I feel like for the first couple of turns he generally wants to stay covered by infantry and not get hit by a whole ton of enemy heavy weapon fire at long range. He can potentially use his buffs for a turn or two and maybe slowly advance up the board, head up to threaten a midfield objective, and if the opponent does try and claim it with something, then he can provide an absolutely enormous countercharge threat, playing more and more aggressive in the mid to late game where it matters a bit less if you lose him. In general, you wouldn't really want to wind up in the situation that Ultramarines armies often do tend to find themselves in when they lose, when basically everything else is dead and it's only Guilliman left on the board. He still might be able to kill a couple more units, but if the enemy is holding a whole bunch of the other objectives, then you've probably already lost. Otherwise, for unit and detachment support, the Oath of Moment could help his damage a little bit. Even though he has tons of it though, it's perhaps not going to be quite as relevant for him, seeing as he already hits on a 2+, you just gain a little bit less for that compared with if you're hitting on a 3. For the generic stratagems, Armour of Contempt could definitely be quite nice on him, very good with a 2+ save, and he could get that free himself as well with his own free stratagem buff. Otherwise, I think the Epic Challenge is pretty relevant for him, being a character who can pretty reliably kill just about any other character in one round of combat could be really quite good for singling out, say, Terminator Lords or the like. And again, just having so much melee threats means that counter-offensive for 2 CP could really be quite big if you're able to interrupt and have him strike first at any point. Otherwise, for Codex units, he generally tends to be helping out other units more than they help him. I feel like he does get on particularly nicely with the combi weapon lieutenant though. If he wanted, he could potentially buddy up with Guilliman to give you an enormous lone operative threat where you can't shoot either part of the combo, as well as having a fairly reasonable damage buff on an objective as well, and it could be marked for the one that Guilliman is going to be walking towards. If he's moving up alongside some vehicles as well, then Tech Marines could also help out with that, triggering the ability and also having lone operative themselves provided they're near vehicles. Out of the Codex detachments, I feel like perhaps the Ironstorm Spearhead seems like an actual weirdly good fit for him. That's the tanks and vehicle focused one, and it's kind of interesting as his stratagems get on particularly well with big Space Marine tanks and vehicles. Getting a second copy of free Armour of Contempt each turn could be really big on things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts or Repulsor Executioners, and the free one in his own turn could trigger the Mercier's Weakness one for a second time. That's the sustained hits one against injured targets that combos really nicely with the Tech Marine Lethal Hits aura. The single reroll definitely doesn't hurt with his own damage output with that enormous Emperor's Sword or Hand of Dominion as well. And even if the stratagems didn't make sense for a turn for whatever reason, the double Oath of Moment could be quite nice just for converting more damage dealing rerolls. Potentially if you're rerolling all hits with some of those scary vehicles that you might have to bear, then you could save those single rerolls for wound rolls perhaps. Otherwise, cycling through them, Gladius does feel like it maybe could be the fluffy detachment for him, seeing as it's vaguely Ultramarines themed. That'd give him easy access to advance and charge and a lance melee stratagem, both of which are quite good there. For the Firestorm Assault Force, there's lots of good options for good battle tactics. Crucible of Battle on another unit is kind of big, or you could do interesting things like give a Land Raider Redeemer the devastating Wound Torrent stratagem. The Assault keyword I guess could be helpful enough, not having to choose between advancing or shooting with the Hand of Dominion. The Vanguard Spearhead might be a little bit more niche, extra durability at range if he gets exposed perhaps. For the Anvil Spearhead, he could trigger the wound rerolls against monsters and vehicles on really quite big stuff for free. Again, that could be really nice on things like Dreadnoughts or Repulsors perhaps. The Stormlance Task Force could give him advance and charge as well, again very big when you've got this much melee, and reactively moving him 6 inches could be seriously nasty. A fairly big enemy turn move phase could be pretty massive when he's got this much raw threat. Finally, he's perhaps more relevant than most in the First Company Task Force as well. Doubling down on Oath of Moment could be really quite big for the full wound reroll turn, though I guess you'd have to absolutely guarantee that it's going to be on a turn where you're going to get some amazing value out of it. Overall, putting that all together, I feel like at 360 points, after the nerfs that Guilliman took, I'd probably rate him as okay, but perhaps no longer quite as standout amazing as he was right at the start of 10th edition, when he had full fat Oath of Moment with the wound rerolls as well, and he also costed fewer points than he does now. He's definitely a really big and scary threat that can make your army list into something really quite different, and with lone operative tricks he's going to be hard to get to grips with. Having a model that can just cause that amount of damage that he does and not be able to be shot directly is a very big thing. Never mind the fact that he's going to be handing out free stratagems or double Oath of Moment as he goes along while doing that. I guess for Ultramarines armies it might be a decision as to whether he's worth it over 360 points more stuff in one form or another. You could certainly get a couple of big meaty squads or some scary tanks for that kind of investment. But overall I think I feel like he's in a fairly good place, playable enough if you want to use him, perhaps particularly in some formations, but not so game warping that he's utterly auto-include, which I feel like he has been in the past. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Primarch of the Ultramarines down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.